Chapter 12. The No Divorce View. In this chapter, I would like to review the argument of the no divorce view, which some refer to as the marriage permanence view. Those that hold to this view believe that divorce is not allowed for any reason, and as a result, all remarriages are adultery unless they occur after the death of one's spouse. They teach that all instances in which divorces appear to be allowed in the New Testament are a result of mistranslations or other misunderstandings. Prominent proponents of the no-divorce view include David Pawson and Joseph A. Webb. I sympathize with the no-divorce view. I have a great deal of sympathy for this view and the teachers involved. I think it is the only popular view that is adamantly against remarriage after divorce, a point I obviously agree with. The late David Pawson, for example, is someone I greatly respect for his bold stances and faithful ministry, and I will quote Pawson's book on this subject throughout this chapter. The no-divorce view proponents insist that divorces are not allowed for any reason, despite what I will argue are clear instances in the Bible where they are, and it forces them to twist Scripture in many instances, as we will see. In my opinion, they end up just as guilty as the permissive view teachers for spreading deception. If they only knew. The sad thing about this situation is that the no-divorce view is totally unnecessary. This view began very recently because those holding to it essentially fell for the deception of people like David Instone Brewer, who teach that a divorce implies the right to remarry. The idea that, if divorces are allowed, then remarriages must also be allowed. The no-divorce view teachers felt that if divorce does indeed imply remarriage as Instone Brewer suggests, then the only way for them to preserve the more important doctrine, that remarriage after divorce is adultery, was to find a way to deny that divorces are allowed. But as I pointed out in Chapter 8, David Instone Brewer and his argument that divorces imply the right to remarry is completely wrong. A divorce did not necessarily imply the right to remarry in history or in the Bible, and so there is no reason to pretend that divorces are not permitted in limited cases. The early church. As I pointed out in Chapter 3, the early church believed that divorces were allowed, but remarriages were not. David Pawson actually agrees with this. Quote, "There does not seem to be a general consensus among them, the early church fathers, which may be summarized as follows. They allowed divorce among Christians, strictly on the sole ground of persistent adultery, but, unlike the Jews, they did not approve of remarriage after such divorce." End quote. Interestingly, Pawson makes no additional comments or offers further explanation as to why the early church would have believed that divorces were allowed. This is notable because in Pawson's view, all instances of divorces being allowed in the New Testament were a result of modern mistranslations of the Greek. If that were the case, one would expect the Greek-speaking early church to hold Pawson's view, since they had access to much earlier texts and spoke Greek. So it really is notable that Pawson offers no explanation for the early church believing that divorces are allowed in the New Covenant. The Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, there is a clear instance of divorce being permitted in the case of indecency. Quote, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house." End quote. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, Jesus agrees that this divorce was permitted in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. Quote, "He said to them, 'Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way.'" End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 8. No divorce view proponents do not typically deny that divorce was permitted in the Old Testament. Instead, they argue that permission to divorce was repealed in the New Testament, as David Pawson does here. Quote, "The law of Moses concerning divorce is only relevant to a Christian discussion insofar as it illuminates the Jewish background against which the Pharisees challenged Jesus to reveal his stance. Christians are not under that law." End quote. The problem for Pawson in Matthew chapter 19 is that when Jesus answers the Pharisees' question about the exception for divorce in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, Jesus starts by saying, quote, "But I say to you," end quote, which is a clear indication that what he is about to say will be a teaching for Christians. Instead of repealing the exception for divorce in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, as Pawson suggests he does, Jesus seems to endorse it, though he shocks everyone, including his disciples, by telling them that if they get divorced, they cannot remarry. Quote, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. So, although some argue that Mosaic divorce laws no longer apply to Christians, Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 19 indicate otherwise. By referencing Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, and stating, quote, "But I say to you," end quote, he offers a teaching for his followers that appears to uphold the Old Testament exception for divorce due to indecency. However, he elevates the moral standard by declaring that remarriage after such a divorce constitutes adultery, which I argue in chapter 6 is something they should have already known but didn't. Porneia. Probably one of the biggest arguments of the no-divorce view centers around the Greek word porneia in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. The no-divorce proponents argue that the word immorality, sometimes translated as fornication in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, is not an exception for divorce at all. Though there are different theories among them as to how to explain this, one popular view is that the underlying Greek word porneia has an extremely narrow meaning, sexual misconduct outside of marriage. In other words, they argue that since porneia, in their view, can only occur before one is married, the exception in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, only applies in cases where someone is betrothed or engaged to be married. This argument usually starts by pointing out that some modern teachers believe that adultery is the correct way to translate porneia in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Then, the no-divorce proponents will show that the Greek word for adultery, mocheia, has a distinct meaning in the New Testament compared to fornication, porneia. For example, in Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, as well as other places, the two words are listed side by side, so they obviously don't mean the exact same thing. Quote, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, mocheia, fornications, porneia, thefts, false witness, slanders." End quote. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19. The no-divorce proponents say that the real meaning of porneia is fornication, that is, sex outside of marriage. They then argue for this extremely narrow meaning for porneia, though many will admit that porneia is used for general sexual immorality in the Bible. To recap this argument, 1. They say that everyone else thinks that porneia only means adultery, but that can't be true because porneia, fornication, and mocheia, adultery, have distinct meanings. And 2. They say that porneia, fornication, only refers to sex outside of marriage. Therefore, Jesus is not giving an exception for divorce, but only an exception that allows one to break off a planned wedding before marriage. David Pawson explains it this way. Quote, "The simplest and most logical answer is that if one, adultery, mocheia, refers to illicit sex after marriage, the other, fornication, porneia, refers to illicit sex before marriage. Therefore, nothing arising after marriage can justify divorce." End quote. Straw man argument. The problem is that this is a classic straw man fallacy. It sets up the idea that everyone thinks fornication means only adultery, giving them credibility when they knock down that straw man argument. The meaning of porneia. The general consensus among Greek scholars as to the meaning of porneia is that it refers to general sexual immorality, including but not limited to adultery. Thayer's Greek lexicon defines porneia as illicit sexual intercourse in general. Another Greek dictionary entry reads as follows. Glossary: sexual immorality, fornication, marital unfaithfulness, prostitution, adultery, a generic term for sexual sin of any kind. Definition: fornication, whoredom, Matthew chapter 15 verse 19, Mark chapter 7 verse 21, and Acts chapter 15 verses 20 and 29. Concubinage, John chapter 8 verse 41. Adultery, Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 and chapter 19 verse 9. Incest, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1. Lewdness, uncleanness, Romans chapter 1 verse 29, symbolically for idolatry, Revelation chapter 2 verse 21 and chapter 14 verse 8. David Pawson briefly acknowledges this general usage for porneia in his book. Quote, fornication, Greek porneia, appears to be applied to both single and married persons in the New Testament. End quote. However, Pawson goes on to argue that the narrow view, only sex before marriage, should be applied in the case of Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, not because of any technical or grammatical reason, but because he says that if it were defined too broadly, it could lead to abuse. Quote, this interpretation introduces more problems. First, it introduces a wider range of grounds. Incest, pedophilia, homosexuality, and even bestiality all qualify. If it includes reaching orgasm with anyone or anything other than one's spouse, could masturbation be squeezed into the list? End quote. Because it could lead to abuse is not a good reason to reject the broader meaning of the word. If Pawson insists on choosing one of the possible meanings of the word, sex before marriage, to the exclusion of the others, he should give a convincing reason why he didn't choose any of the other possible meanings of the word. A. Andrew Das points out that leading proponents of this betrothal view admit that this narrow usage of porneia is not something that they can prove. Quote, in fact, Heth and Wenham concede their inability to find an unequivocal instance of porneia describing unchastity during the betrothal period, a rather serious problem for this position. End quote. So what does porneia mean? Major Greek lexicons and dictionaries define porneia broadly. For instance, the Louw-Nida Greek-English lexicon describes it as referring to, quote, every kind of extramarital, unlawful, or immoral sexual intercourse, end quote. Similarly, the BDAG lexicon, Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich, includes adultery, fornication, prostitution, incest, and other forms of unlawful sexual behavior under the umbrella of porneia. Porneia is ambiguous, just like ervat davar in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. I would argue that the term porneia is meant to be somewhat equivalent to ervat davar in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, which is the reason the Pharisees were questioning Jesus in the first place. They were essentially asking him to define ervat davar in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, which is also a decidedly ambiguous term for sexual immorality. Here's a case for this view. 1. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, it permits a man to issue a certificate of divorce if he finds something indecent, ervat davar, in his wife. The phrase is somewhat ambiguous, but it is generally interpreted to mean some form of sexual misconduct or indecency. The Septuagint translates ervat davar as aschemon pragma, meaning a shameful thing or indecency, which implies a broad category of sexual immorality. 2. Many scholars believe that ervat in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, alludes to the prohibitions in Leviticus chapter 18 regarding the uncovering of nakedness, erva, in incestuous or illicit relationships. These prohibitions cover a wide range of sexual sins beyond simple adultery, including incest, homosexuality, and bestiality. And 3. When Jesus discusses divorce in Matthew chapter 19, the Pharisees specifically ask about the grounds for divorce permitted by Moses. This question likely reflects debates among the Jewish schools of thought, for example, Shammai versus Hillel, on the meaning of ervat davar in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. By using porneo in his response, Jesus might have been referring to the broad category of sexual sins alluded to in Deuteronomy and clarified in Leviticus chapter 18. But adulterers were stoned. Though many will agree that porneia is a general term for sexual immorality, including adultery, some will have objections to this. As we have seen, adultery is not a good translation of porneia because adultery has its own Greek word, mocheia. However, porneia can include adultery in its meaning, among other forms of sexual immorality. Another way to look at this is that though porneia doesn't only mean bestiality, it does include bestiality as a part of its meaning, and it's the same with adultery. To this, some no-divorce proponents will say that adultery can't be in view in the porneia of Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, because adulterers were supposed to be stoned. So adultery can't be an exception for divorce since the punishment for adultery was stoning. Therefore, there was no need to divorce a wife who was guilty of adultery. However, It is widely known that by the Second Temple period, in Jesus' day, the Jews did not enforce the death penalty. During Jesus' time, Judea and Galilee were under Roman rule. The Roman government did not permit the Jewish authorities to carry out death sentences independently, as evidenced by their involvement in the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. In John chapter 18, verse 31, the Jewish leaders explicitly state, quote, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death," end quote, indicating that capital punishment required Roman approval. Jewish tradition, as recorded in the Mishnah, compiled around 200 Common Era, reflects a significant hesitancy towards enacting the death penalty. The Mishnah in Makot chapter 1 verse 10 records that a Sanhedrin that executed one person in 7 years, or even 70 years, was considered to be a lot of executions. Therefore, any adultery committed in Jesus' day would have needed to end in divorce, not stoning. If stoning did happen in cases of adultery, they would be the exception, likely done in secret, if at all. See John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. The inclusive approach. Erasmus did it. Another option for the no divorce proponents regarding the exception clause in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, is to claim that the Greek phrase except for immorality should not be understood as an allowance for divorce and remarriage due to sexual immorality. Instead, they say that the wording signifies a stricter prohibition, and it should be translated as something like not even in the case of unchastity or not even for adultery. David Pawson, who offers this view as an alternative approach in the appendix of his book, attributes it to Leslie McFall and says the following about it. Quote, McFall has pointed out that the great majority of Greek manuscripts of Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, do not include the word except, only the phrase not over fornication. The word not, Greek me, is a particle of negation and would normally indicate an exclusion rather than an exception. He was virtually saying, not even for fornication, even if that word is used to cover all sexual sin, including adultery. End quote. Erasmus did it. McFall and others who hold this view often blame Erasmus of Rotterdam for all the confusion. Erasmus was a prominent 16th century scholar and theologian known for his work in humanism and for producing one of the earliest printed editions of the Greek New Testament, called the Textus Receptus. Leslie McFall argues that Erasmus's compilation of the Greek New Testament played a crucial role in shaping how later readers interpreted Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. McFall claims that Erasmus's edition included a specific Greek phrase in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 that implied an exception for divorce due to sexual immorality. However, McFall suggests that Erasmus might have chosen certain Greek manuscripts that reflected this reading while excluding others, thereby favoring a more permissive interpretation. A mutually exclusive view. Before I get into the details about why I believe the inclusive view is wrong, I want to point out that this view is mutually exclusive with the other no-divorce view that we looked at earlier, in which porneia was narrowly interpreted to be about betrothals only. You can't have it both ways. Either Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 is saying that you can't get a divorce unless you are breaking off a betrothal, or it's saying that there really is no exception at all. If you tried to combine the two no-divorce explanations for this passage, you would get a contradiction, as it would essentially be saying you can't get a divorce at all, and you can't even break off a betrothal for sexual immorality either. This would be problematic, as it would imply that Joseph was planning to sin when he contemplated putting Mary away in the Gospels. David Pawson, in the appendix of his book, seems to understand that endorsing McFall's view would render his book meaningless. After explaining the view in the appendix, he then denounces it. Quote, "It remains to add this author's opinion of McFall's case. In a word, I am not convinced. But whether the negative not should be taken to mean if not or not even is, I believe, open to debate. The fact that Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 does have except, or rather the Greek is literally apart from, might support a similar meaning in chapter 19 verse 9, but could also indicate an adaptation of the latter text to conform to the former." End quote. Pawson makes some good points here about the problems with McFall's theory. Let me explain what he is saying in more detail. Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 is unambiguously an exception clause. A good reason to reject the inclusive view is found in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32, which is the other passage where we find an exception for divorce besides Matthew chapter 19 verse 9. In Matthew chapter 5 verse 32, the Greek words used to express an exception for divorce clearly and unambiguously mean an exception. It cannot be inclusive. Quote, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of porneia, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 5 verse 32. Quote, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for porneia, and marries another woman commits adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 19 verse 9. A. Andrew Das points out that the Greek words in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 are consistently used as an exception in the New Testament, making the inclusive view unlikely. Quote, "If the inclusive approach to Matthew chapter 19 verse 9 were correct, one would expect the parallel exception clause in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 to be inclusive as well, even though the wording is different. Normally an adverb, the word except, when with a genitive noun, functions as an improper preposition and means apart from, an exclusive sense. Acts chapter 26 verse 29 and 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 28. Similarly, in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32, the word signals an exception to the absolute prohibition. The exclusive use of the exception clause in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 renders it unlikely for ground of unchastity in the Matthean doublet of chapter 19 verse 9 to be taken inclusively." End quote. The early church problem. Another problem with the inclusive view is that 1,000 years before Erasmus, the early church was interpreting Matthew chapter 19 verse 9 as an exception to divorce. One example of this is John Chrysostom. Quote, "Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and marry another, committeth adultery." End quote. John Chrysostom, a homily on Matthew chapter 19. As we discussed in chapter 3, the early church fathers often spoke Greek, and they surely had access to earlier Greek manuscripts than we do. While this is not definitive proof, it's strong evidence that the inclusive view cannot be true. But interpreting Matthew chapter 19 verse 9 as an exception clause was not unique to the Greek fathers. It extended to the Latin fathers such as Augustine as well. Quote, "Neither can it rightly be held that a husband who dismisses his wife because of fornication and marries another does not commit adultery himself. For there is also adultery on the part of those who, after the repudiation of their former wives because of fornication, marry others. This adultery, nevertheless, is certainly less serious than that of men who dismiss their wives for reasons other than fornication and take other wives. We recognize that both are adulterers." End quote. Augustine. The incest view. Before I close this chapter, I will briefly mention a third option for the no-divorce proponents, which is also mutually exclusive with the other arguments and far less popular, which I will call the incest view. The incest view is that Jesus' exception for divorce in Matthew refers only to unlawful marriages within forbidden kinship, incestuous relationships outlined in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 through 18. Therefore, his prohibition of divorce applies to all valid marriages, and remarriage is entirely forbidden, even in the case of adultery. This strict interpretation narrows the meaning of porneia to these specific illicit unions, and aligns with the absolute prohibitions against divorce and remarriage found in Mark and Luke. Das says of this view, quote, "The church fathers do not interpret the Matthean exception clauses as referring to the sort of unlawful marriage described in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 through 18. They also never translate porneia in terms of incest. Matthew would not likely have included an ethical teaching here of little relevance for his Jewish Christian audience, especially in view of Jesus' reference to what was said among the Jews of his day about the issuing of divorce certificates." End quote. Das has a rather detailed and technical refutation of this view in his book, but as the view is somewhat rare, I will not devote any more time to it in this already lengthy chapter, and instead point the reader to A. Andrew Das's excellent book. Conclusion. In conclusion, while I hold deep respect for proponents of the no-divorce view, I find their interpretation of Scripture regarding divorce unconvincing. The no-divorce view seems to be a reactionary stance, developed in response to scholars like David Instone Brewer, who argue that divorce implies the right to remarry. By accepting this premise, proponents feel compelled to deny any allowance for divorce in Scripture to uphold the sanctity of marriage. However, as I've discussed, this linkage between divorce and the right to remarry is not a necessary one, either historically or biblically. The early church, which permitted divorce but prohibited remarriage, serves as proof of this fact. Attempts to narrow the definition of porneia to premarital sexual misconduct or to reinterpret Jesus' exception clauses as inclusive rather than exclusive lack substantial linguistic and historical support. The Greek term porneia is widely understood by scholars to encompass a broad range of sexual immorality, including adultery. The early church fathers, fluent in Greek and closer to the original manuscripts, interpreted passages like Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, as allowing divorce in cases of sexual immorality, though not permitting remarriage thereafter.